The war had ended 1,000 years ago, yet somehow humanity still carried its scars among the stars. Dust rose in sheets from the track as the morning sun broke through the hangar's mouth. It washed the long, ribbed surface in a harsh white that turned shadows into knives. Engines slept. Cables snaked like dried riverbeds. On the far side, the kennel gates stood open, heat shimmering above them, and the sharp ozone tang of sterilizers stung the air. Mara stood alone, helmet tucked under one arm, the other hand resting on the stanchion rail. Her breath misted in the coolness that survived the dawn, then vanished. Beyond the hangar, the training compound unrolled in metallic lines, a geometry of discipline. The track was a circle of tempered composite whose skin hummed with the memory of 1,000 footfalls. It led outward to the red flats, to the basalt spires, to the thought of nowhere and everywhere, and to the line where Earth's descendants learned how not to die. They came to her as a shadow moving through a brighter shadow, pack silent, fluid, shoulders rolling like a tide. Rakari, the base called them in the broad tongue. Their own word tasted like dust when pronounced by human mouths, RKR tall. They were hunters whose homeworld had died by degrees, ice crusting over jungles, wind carving bone out of the ground, machines sighing to silence. Their packs had crossed black oceans to sell skill for fuel. They ran where others faltered. They fought where others fled. The Alpha stepped into the light with the measured grace of an old oath. He was taller than Mara by a head, taller still with the backward jut of his cranial spines. Armor plates interlaced his shoulders like a cathedral of dark scales. The scar down his muzzle, a pale fork of lightning, caught the sun and threw it back. Behind him, limping, was a smaller shape, legs unsteady, breath a ragged stitch. A cub. Its eyes were the color of submerged steel. Every step was a question it was losing the will to ask. Mara heard the quiet wave that passed through the base at their approach. Technicians paused over tethered drones. A medic, leaning on a cart of accelerant packs, raised a hand halfway and let it fall. Between posts of light, the dust hung like a slow river. She slung the helmet against her thigh and went to meet the Alpha. He did not greet her in words. He looked at the track, then at the cub, then at Mara. He had seen her run with the quiet intensity of someone who had nowhere to be except where her feet carried her. She ran for the same reason some people prayed, without a bargain in mind, only an answer. "Name him," Mara asked softly, turning the helmet in her hands, almost as if showing she would not lift a weapon while the question hung between them. The Alpha's head dipped a fraction. "Kher," he said, voice like gravel ground in a hollow. It was a sound with more exhale than syllable. Mara crouched so she was lower than the cub. This was respect in the Rakari way and something else in the human way. Kher's ribs moved beneath the mottled fur like birds trying to escape. He looked past her toward the long white of the track. "You came to run," she said, "but not to finish." Kher blinked as if the words were rain cooling him. Mara reached into the helmet and drew out the sweat-damp band that lined it, wrung it once and held it to the cub's mouth. He sniffed, wary, then licked. Salt, familiar. A thing that made the world feel less like an enemy. The Alpha watched. Silence in the Rakari lexicon was not absence, it was attention. It was breath held for the sake of truth. Mara felt the weight of it on her shoulders like mail. "You know our ritual," the Alpha said eventually. His eyes were colder than the morning. They carried something from glaciers, from wounds earth deep. He must run with the pack. He must fall and rise with the pack. The 3rd furlong and the 7th, the 9th and the 20th, he must finish, or he is not chosen. Mara stood. The sun climbed. Somewhere behind them a power unit thumped and came alive, and a line of lights down the right flank of the track pulsed in sequence, like a heartbeat that was more architecture than animal. She looked at the track. She had worn that surface thin with her own steps, on nights when memory hunted her, on mornings when she hunted it back. "We can run together," she said. The Alpha's spines tilted, a question asked in cartilage. "Together? You set the pace," Mara said. "I'll keep it. The pack keeps the pace, the cub must keep the pack, and if he can't, Mara asked, then he is not chosen. Mara let the sun rest on her face. The warmth sank into the tired ache along her jaw. She had been awake since before the first siren birds trailed their song over the compound. She had been awake since something shifted in her sleep and refused to shift back. She looked at Kher, who stood as if the ground moved under him in small malicious waves. Rituals make sense, she said, voice low. Until they don't, then what they measure isn't worth measuring. Are you his pack or his judge? The alpha growled, but the sound was restrained, a knife kept sheathed. You presume to teach us the meaning of our words. I presume to learn them, Mara said, while he's still able. The human and the alpha faced each other in the light that thickened with a desert's promise. Around them the base held its breath, or pretended not to. This wasn't a confrontation, it was gravity redistributing between two bodies. The larger shifted minutely but did not break orbit. Run, the alpha said. Mara nodded once, and in that nod was a contract not written on any alloy. She set the helmet down by the stanchion. The metal kissed metal. She placed a hand on Kher's back. It was hot, the heat that comes after fever when the body burns the house down to find one intruder. They moved to the line embedded in the track. The faint magnetic hum underfoot aligned bones with an insistence that felt like readiness. Impulses whispered through sensors, taking their measurements. 3 bodies, 2 species, one intent whose mathematics defied their cold logic. The pack assembled beyond the far opening, a knot of dark grace and alert angles. They glanced once at Mara, once at the alpha, and then stilled with the patience of spearheads. The alpha stood beside the line, not on it, as a thing that guards the threshold rather than crossing it. Mara took a breath that reached her toes and let it out while counting the scars on the far gate, 1 too many. Kher trembled. He looked too small, then not small at all, like a stone that holds a story larger than the giant who throws it. The alpha lifted his hand, an old signal, 2 beats of silence. The third was the start, they ran. Mara's shoe struck the track and the old rhythm reached up like a forgotten friend. Kher loped, gait uneven, but the first furlong is a promise you make and decide later whether to keep. The pack bounded ahead, a loose river of muscle. The alpha did not move. Mara set her breath to a pattern, in, out, like solder feeding a seam. The track's curve leaned into their ankles. Heat rose in curtains from the metal. Beyond the compound's geometry, spires stabbed the sky with patient violence. The world duplicated itself in Kher's eyes. She watched his flanks for the hiss of pain that precedes collapse. His head bobbed, then steadied. He was too proud to whine. Pride is a beautiful rope until you tie it around your neck. The first furlong slid under them. The second bit gently. At the third, Kher stumbled, forefoot scraping, and dropped to a knee. Mara slowed, not stopping, not pushing, just making a space in the speed where decisions could live. The pack passed through the far gate's lock of light and vanished into the white glare beyond. Alone on the circle, woman and cub existed in a different kind of motion. Up, Mara said, not harsh, not soft like a door that opens when you lean on it but breaks if you hang. Kher rose, his breath was a saw. The scalp along his neck rippled, he ran. The fourth furlong came, and with it the way sunlight shifts when your body starts to steal it. At the seventh his legs shook like reeds in a crosswind, he fell. Mara was already there, not catching him, because catching breaks something in the falling, but shaping the space so that the ground forgave him. He hit. He curled. He made no sound. The alpha's shadow fell across them even before his feet did. Mara hadn't heard him approach. He was simply there, a mountain that moved on pause instead of plate tectonics. Done, he said. Mara looked up through the heat shimmer. The alpha's eyes were not cruel. Cruelty is a blunt tool and alphas use sharp ones. His gaze was like snow that appears in the mouth of a cave you've just entered. Surprising, cold, reflecting your own breath back at you. Not done, she said. He fell where he should have stood. He fell where he could, Mara said, and I saw him try. I saw how much he had to spend and how much he spent anyway. That coin is worth what we say it is. You can say it's counterfeit, or you can let the value be real because he burned his hands to make it. The Alpha's jaw worked just once. You speak as if we did not bury our young by thousands when the winds came. I speak as if you don't have to bury this one. It is not a matter of wanting, the Alpha said, as if to explain to a child the weight of iron. It is the way. He will not survive the route. If he cannot endure the 9th furlong, the 20th will kill him. Mara felt her heart at the base of her tongue, pounding the clear truth of survival. She reached under Kher's forelegs. He was light, lighter than he should have been. The body recalculates its mass in the hour of threat. She lifted him. Her back remembered other liftings. A sister pulled from smoke, a boy hauled from the riptide of a scrimmage gone wrong on a low-gravity world, a friend dragged laughing from a bar fight in a mining town where laughter and blood smelled the same. Mara stood with Kher in her arms. The Alpha's spines rose, an involuntary flare of disbelief that blurred into something like fury and stopped. No, he said, a low frequency. A thunder held behind the mountain. The air around his teeth cooled. Yes, she said, if you carry him, he has not run. If I carry him, Mara said, he has not died. The Alpha took a step. The pack was a dark line against a brighter one farther off. Time became a pool and the day fell into it like a stone. Our way is older than your species' flight. We do not cut it to fit a single neck. We don't cut, Mara said. We shoulder. The Alpha stood very still. He was a blade whose point turned inward for the space of a long breath. Kher's eyes were half closed, but his fingers had knotted into Mara's jacket without permission from either of them. The Alpha saw this, and the base saw the Alpha seeing it. Then if you carry, he said, voice scraped down to the truth, I will follow. It was an old words form they used for embracing a leader at the edge of a cliff. It meant, I will walk behind you so that, if you turn into death, my eyes will catch it before yours do. It meant, also, I will hold your shadow on my teeth so it is yours and not some other's. Mara nodded once. It was an economy of motion that people use when movement itself is expensive. She shifted Kher's small weight, found the balance with the memory of all the heavy things she had done that did not look like carrying. Holding silence for a dying friend, holding secrets until they became part of her bones, holding her rage like a lit coal so it would burn what it should and not her. She set off down the track. The 9th furlong came and passed under her feet like a threshold she built while stepping. The Alpha followed, 1 pace back and 2 to the left, the place where protection walks. Soldiers at the fence line watched, hands on rails, and did not speak. More shadows joined beside the Alpha. The pack had doubled back off the route to a parallel path outside the fence, keeping speed with the human who carried what they called weak and what she called alive. The 11th furlong laid its small knives along her calves. The 13th counted her ribs with its own fingers. The 15th found the place where breath and will part ways and made them promise to reconcile for one more stride. She felt the old crack in her right ankle wake up and yawn like a bad friend. She held on. Kher blinked, then slept, then woke into a tiny panic that was all pupils and claws. His hands found her again and made her jacket into home. The Alpha watched, and in his eyes something like a temple fell very quietly and did not make a sound. He moved with that change inside him, and in his shadow moved the change in all who followed him. Even silence makes waves if it is deep enough. At the 20th furlong, the world might have narrowed to a thread, but instead it widened. Mara stepped through a line of light and out into the flats that simmered with heat. The track became a ribbon that vanished into the diamond glare of noon. The far horizon looked like a blade laid flat against the sky, just edged enough to cut the day in two. Her arms ached with a pain that was not dull and not sharp, a pain that had become its own companion. Sweat ran down her spine. The air tasted like copper. She set one foot in front of the other, again and again, as if that were a new game that had never been invented. The Alpha did not speak. The language they used now was older than words. It was step, breath, watch. When dust rose under Mara's feet, it curled over her boots, spread its little sorrows, and settled again. He counted her breaths without meaning to and synchronized his to them. It made no sense. He did it anyway. They passed under a high gate that marked the third of the route. There were bones set into the gate, not as a threat but as a record. A human femur on the right, old and polished by wind. A Rakari jaw on the left, teeth like the ridges born in lava as it cools. No titles. The ones who had died on the route did not need titles. The route had given them names that could be read only by those who watched the dust. The Alpha's gaze flicked to the human bone, then to Mara. He had buried too many young not to see the angle of wrists where grief leaves its shadow years later. He had thought he understood humans, pliable, opportunistic, genius engineers of compromise. He had not seen this kind of stubbornness since the last windstorm on his homeworld had bitten through the pack's barricades and found them anyway. They turned into a stretch where the sun's shape was less an orb than a white opinion. Heat hammered up from the track and made the air parched like an old mind. Mara's lips cracked, and she licked blood and salt and kept moving, because the body is a simple machine when you let it be. Kher stirred in her arms now and then, a small storm that had strength only for lightning, not thunder. Memories came into the empty place behind Mara's focus, because that is what memories do when the world is reduced to muscle. She saw a doorway in a bunker on Ceres' colony, where children drew constellations with grease pencils on the wall, because the stars felt too far otherwise. She saw a field in the gray light of Earth's winter where a man knelt to fix a fence that had seen 5 generations of wind. She saw a little room where a commander pressed her forehead to the window while the ship's engines muttered, and Mara held her hand and said nothing because sometimes love is just not speaking until the other person can. The Alpha smelled the salt of those memories because humans carry their past like scent. He watched the line of Mara's shoulders. He listened to the sound of her footfalls, which did not say triumph, but something steadier and smaller and infinite. He watched the way the pack's young looked at her when they flanked the fence, whose mesh threw thin shadows on their faces like the bars of a cage they were just now thinking to outgrow. At the 33rd furlong, there was a section of track whose composite had laid up wrong during a season when the base's technicians were drunk with small victories. The surface had a rippled flaw that looked like the skin of a lake under wind. It didn't care about the weight you carried, only the truth that you carried it. It punished the lie of your posture. Mara hit it and felt the rhythm of her ankles threaten to become chaos. Left, the Alpha said, the first word he had spoken in hours. It was instruction without pride. Mara shifted her weight left, letting the ripples run down the outside edges of her feet like a secret river. Pain became pain again instead of a dissertation on the nature of pain. She put her mouth to a shape that could have been gratitude but remained unnamed. They moved. The base had emptied by the time they reached the far curve. People came and stood with hands shaded to brows. Some recorded, their devices blinking, then stopped recording because the light on their screens felt wrong, like laughter at a funeral. A medic walked parallel beyond the fence, carrying water but not offering it. This was the route. There were rules you did not break, and there were rules you sacrificed to something more important than rules. Kher woke with a small sound like a trapped breath opening. He looked up at Mara, then around her, then beyond. His gaze found the Alpha. He reached one hand awkwardly toward him. The Alpha took 3 long steps forward, broke his own place of following, and touched 2 claws to Kher's fingers through the fence of air. "Run," the Alpha said softly. Kher's mouth moved. The sound he made was so small that even Mara was not sure it had left his body. It sounded like agreement or surrender. Sometimes they are the same. Sometimes they cannot be told apart until years later when you learn which gods you fed and which you starved. At the fourth gate, 2/3 of the route, a place where people drop and decide to stay dropped, the crosswind woke and came out of the flats with knives. It split the dust into guillotines and set them moving at waist height. The fence sang its thin metal song. Mara bent her head and made her shoulders a house. She felt each grain of sand as an individual making a decision about her skin. A woman at the fence line lifted a hand and touched her own collarbone without seeming to know it. A Rakari elder crouched on his heels like a stone that had chosen to walk, and now wondered what came next. The alpha's spines flattened against his skull so sand could not nest there and make a home. He drew closer, breath deepening, and opened his mouth to bare his teeth at the wind. It changed nothing. He did it anyway. They passed the 40th furlong. Beyond it, the track rose into a shallow incline whose cruelty lay not in its angle but in its length. It was a slope that asked, "What do you have left?" and then asked again and then again until the answer was a new word. As they climbed, the world arranged itself into a simple equation: gravity, heartbeat, will. Mara spoke for the first time since the 20th furlong. Her voice had been scratched by the sand until it sounded like a violin bowed with wire. Almost. The alpha heard the word and a strange twist pulled at the old scar on his muzzle. Little old words survive inside the new ones. In his people's language, there was a term for this point on a run, a name like a breath at the hinge of a door. It meant between breaths, between deaths. It meant, if you can take one more step, you are a different person than you were. It meant, if you cannot, we will bury the person you were. Mara took another step. On the crest, the wind ceased with the abruptness of a thought changed. The flats on the other side lay as clean as a communion table. Far ahead, where the track made its final bend and joined itself like a healed wound, a group had gathered. Pack, medics, command, technicians, those who had once run and those who would never. The quiet that came over them had no room in it for triumph or for fear, only for attention. Kher moved in Mara's arms and lifted his head. The world had become bearable again. He sniffed the air that had traveled through 100 mouths to find him and carried them all. His eyes found the line, 2 bands of dark embedded in the luminous skin of the track, the arrival with no speeches. "Look," Mara whispered, not command, invitation. His fingers flexed. The alpha watched this without moving any other part of his body. He held stillness like a spear. Mara felt her left foot go as numb as a planet you've never visited. She did not adjust to it. She let her body solve it without her opinion. She was an animal with a job, and the job was to take one more step. Kher's head grew heavier. Exhaustion is the ocean that makes everyone a sailor or a drowned thing. She refused the choice and simply kept her hand on the tiller. The 55th furlong flowed under them. Near the home stretch, the crowd moved in a way that was not a surge, more like a careful leaning in. The pack's young ran parallel again, not touching the fence, in places not even looking at it because the line between inside and outside had turned into something softer and not yet named. The alpha's breath became audible now, a controlled thunder. He looked beyond Mara for a threat because that was his nature, and also because he could not bear to look at her for too long and think about what she meant. At the final bend, the base commander, old-eyed, broad-shouldered, a woman whose jawline had outlived every lover she'd had, stepped forward to the edge. She put her hand over her heart. Not salute. Witness. She had seen battles that would never be written down because the people who fought them were not pretty enough or dead enough to make good myths. This one she would remember because it was both ugly and beautiful and would not fit on any screen. Mara saw the line. The light around it did not change. Victory has no color of its own. She saw her hands, which had always been good at holding and were holding now. She saw Kher's face as he woke into understanding and into the kind of relief that makes you cry or breathe or both. "Down," she murmured. He stirred. He moved. Feet touched track. He stood because standing was the last fair thing left to do. His legs shook, but they did not fail. Mara loosened her arms around him and they made them into air. Air that smelled like metal and salt and something like pine, even though there was no pine on this planet. The Alpha took one step forward and then stopped, as if he had almost broken something and remembered just in time not to. Kher looked at the line. It was a line. It was also a river. He looked at Mara. She did not nod. She only looked back. He stepped. Once, then twice. He crossed. The sound the crowd made was not applause, not cheering. It was breath. Released breath. Thousands of lungs letting go of what they had held since the first furlong. The noise climbed and fell and washed the base clean. The Alpha walked forward into the space that opened like a door and put his hand on Kher's head. He closed his eyes just once. When he opened them, there was a different kind of light there, the kind that only appears when something old admits something new without asking to be thanked for it. Mara swayed. The world tipped, then flattened. Kher turned and leaned into her leg, pressing his tiny life like a stamp against the envelope of her bone. She put her hand on the back of his neck and felt the pulse there, a little drum that will one day call to a hunt and for now called only to the day. The Alpha looked at Mara. Up close, the threads of pale scar tissue across his muzzle looked like a map of a river delta, a geography of loss. He bowed, slow, deliberate, a thing you do when you are recataloguing the universe. You carry as if your arms are the last bridge between worlds. Mara might have smiled, or maybe her face had only learned a new way to rest. Sometimes the last bridge is the only bridge. Why? The Alpha asked. The word sat heavy like a stone you set on a grave so that the wind will remember it too. Because someone carried us, Mara said simply, and the air around the sentence warmed with 100 names and no explanations. Medics came with water and careful hands. The commander came with eyes that had made difficult choices, and now made a different kind. The pack came, first the young, then the old, and smelled Kher's hair and the salt on Mara's skin, and the line on the ground which was still a line even if it had become a story. Over the hour that followed, the base softened like metal cooled correctly. Slabs of shade were pushed into place. A ring of tents went up with the efficient kindness of those who have done this before. The wind settled into a lower voice. Beyond the fence, the spires sat like old teeth, pleased to watch without biting. The Alpha did not leave Mara's side, and when he did he circled back, as if mapping a world around a new sun. He watched Kher drink, watched his paws settle, watched his eyes close with sleep that was medicine and not escape. He watched Mara lean back against a stanchion, eyes shut, the tight knots in her jaw relaxing one by one like sailors' knots loosened by rain. After a while, he said, "We lost the old road." The words came out as if their edges still cut his mouth. On our world before the ice, there was a pass between the highlands. The old ones ran their young there, and the wind tested teeth and heart. We mark it even now in our stories. But the ice came and ate the pass. We kept the run and moved it to the flats. We kept the rules and moved them to the flats. We did not move the mercy. Mara's eyes opened. The sun had rolled a little to the west as if considering its options. Sometimes the map becomes the territory, she said. He tilted his head. The translation implant behind his ear hummed softly. Our cubs who cannot fall behind the pack die from the cold much later when the storm finds them, or they live and their eyes never warm. We call it surviving. It is not. Then don't call it that, Mara said. The Alpha's spines rose in something like a shrug. It was a gesture more human than he realized. You think words can change wind. I think they can change the direction you face while the wind works. He made a sound that was neither agreement nor dissent. The day's heat softened around them. The crowd dispersed to the kind of busy that follows holy things. A technician secured the gate's bone tokens against the chance of thieves who collected meaning like coins. The commander spoke into her cuff in a tone that iron recognizes. The Alpha stepped closer, lowered himself until he could sit with his back against the same stanchion that held Mara up. Steel met scale with a small, practical sound. He stretched his legs out in front of him like a tired cathedral. "My father," he began, and the beginning was the hardest part, ran the pass when the ice was a rumor. He fell in the 6th furlong. He stood and ran until the sky peeled. His Alpha carried him the last 2 furlongs. No one saw. They came in at night to the smell of blood and the river's voice. The pack accepted my father because the Alpha said he had finished. Tradition held. Mercy hid inside it. That is the story I don't tell. Mara watched the skin of his face the way you watch light change on water to know what the weather will do. Why tell it now? He inclined his head toward Kher, sleeping against the side of Mara's boot, his small breaths measuring all the distances that mattered. Because if stories don't come when you call them, they're not yours anymore. They sat a long time in a silence that was a basin where the day could pour itself and cool. At dusk, the sky turned the color of an old bruise, and the base's lights lifted their small moons above the track. The cooling fans in the hangar took up their evening hum. People found food that tasted like home even if it wasn't, because eating is how you shelter in place when the world has moved you too far in one day. The Alpha stood. Mara stood. Kher woke and made the sound of someone who had discovered that waking could be kind. They walked together to the bone gate. The commander met them there with a pair of cords, one white, one dark, that the base used once, rarely. When something had happened that the rulebook did not predict, she spoke to the Alpha first. "We have a ceremony for this, but the text is only half written. Will you help me finish it?" The Alpha looked at the cords. They were not the kind of honor his people wore. They were human colors for human eyes. He took the dark cord patterned with thin gray lines. "Our words will sit awkwardly in your hands." The commander smiled a short, tired smile. "Most truths do." They turned to Kher. He stood as straight as his legs would allow. He looked from one tall adult to the other as if the sky had learned to divide itself into halves that somehow made a whole. The Alpha knelt, and by kneeling he raised the height of what the moment could hold. He looped the dark cord around Kher's neck. "Kher of the Run," he said in a voice that belonged to the part of him that had once believed the past would last forever. "Kher of the Carried Furlong. Kher of the breath that did not break. You belong to us because you chose not to belong to death." He stood, then stepped aside so that Mara could come forward. Her hands shook small human shakes that the string magnified into a visible tremble. She tied the white cord beneath the dark like tying a blessing onto the bottom of a boat so that no wave could find it and steal it. "Kher," she said, quietly enough that the cords themselves could hear. "When you carry someone someday, you'll think of this. You won't know why. It will just be there. That will be enough." Kher stared up at her, pupils wide, breath a little bird under his ribs. He did not speak. He did not need to. The Alpha watched the human and the cub, then lifted his gaze to the commander, to the base, to the world of metal and heat and stubborn breath. He felt something shift in the place where his people kept their laws. A law that has never been broken is either too good or too brittle. He did not want brittle laws. He lifted his head and let his voice roll across the track like a tide coming home to a harbor that had been missing a shape and finally found it. "Here," he called in the Rakari tongue, and the pack turned from their food, from their shade, from the work that had kept their hands busy against the thought of certain changes. "This is Kher of the Carried Furlong. He has finished the route." They bowed, a ripple made of many spines. The sound they made after, the one like rain on long grass, was pride that had found a new field. Some made the old gesture for remembrance. Some did not because they were already remembering. The old ones nodded like trees that will not be moved but will accept a new bird in the branches. The commander touched her cuff and sent a message into the base nets, and soon beyond, because nothing stays on one world anymore when the stars are listening. The message had no marketing polish. It had data and a small story and an image of 3 figures against a track that looked like the spine of a god laid bare. It spread as real things do to those ready to receive it. That night the base slept in the way bases do when something has arrived to stand beside the rules so they are steadier. Wind softened. Lamps burned without sputter. The silence inside the hangar felt like a lake in which everyone could finally see themselves, and each other, reflected correctly for a moment. Mara lay on her bunk and stared at the slat above her head and let her bones rehearse the day they had done. She held the shape of Kher's weight in her wrist, the echo of it traveling up to her elbow, to her shoulder, to her throat. She felt the presence of the Alpha beyond the wall. Funny how bodies keep their gravity through distance, and the way his story had become a small warm candle in the room of her mind. When sleep took her, she went quietly, as if leaving a friend's apartment after a long talk when both of you know that nothing has been solved but everything has been changed. Morning came with the crisp bite of dawn. The track steamed. The bone gate glowed briefly. Mara rose before the whistle and went out to run, because one day does not complete a life. It only shows you how to start the next one. She found the Alpha waiting by the stanchion where they had shared the afternoon. Kher stood beside him, cord bright, tail a little more certain. The boy's eyes were clear as river water in winter. No fever. The scar of exhaustion had become a thin line drawn across yesterday. They stood in silence for a while, watching the light climb the ribs of the track and lace them with bright. The Alpha moved his head in a gesture that held as much weight as most people's speeches. "Run," he said. Mara looked at Kher. "Run." They set off, not ceremony now, not duty, but the simple human and Rakari joy of moving across a surface together. Kher kept the pace not because pride nailed it to him, but because his legs enjoyed the work. The Alpha followed by half a step and no more. Mara laughed once, not loud, not long, but with the kind of pleasure that leaves fingerprints. They ran until breath built its small temple between their ribs, and then they ran through it and out the other side. The wind lifted as if to take a closer look, then decided to stay a while. The commander watched from the hangar, coffee cup in one hand, weariness slung from her shoulders like a cloak she could finally loosen. She nodded to nobody and to everything. By midday, another message arrived from a nearby colony on a harsh moon whose tidal storms had threatened the younger workers. It was a recording. A human foreman, eyes lined by the work of his days, spoke on a shaky feed. "Heard about your run," he said. "Kid got lost in the storm 2 nights ago. We used to wait it out. We don't now. We went after him, took turns carrying, brought him back. Don't know what you people did up there, but thanks." The commander played the message in the mess. People looked at their plates, at one another, at their hands. No one said the word that hung over the tables like a new banner: permission. You had it now, to carry, to ask for carrying, to change just enough and no more. Word spread outward. It always does. On Al-Qaziyah station, a pilot carrying freight through ion storms made a detour to pick up a stranded shuttle with a blown relay, because she had listened to the story on a static-laced channel, and found that her course could be a little kinder, without losing any of the speed she'd promised. On a mining rig above the blue desert of Triel, a Rakari Jr. refused to leave his injured human supervisor behind when the lift horns sang their urgent song. He strapped the big man to his chest and snarled at anyone who called it unseemly. At a school in a shaded canyon on Clyra, teachers walked slower between classes and the children noticed, and asked to help carry the stacks of learning tablets so their arms would know the shape of help young. The story moved not like a ship on a route, but like water through stone. Slow, inevitable, patient, finding the places where the world had cracked and making of them something soft and bright. Around this time in the day, the base had a tradition of broadcast, a 10-minute slot where news ran across the loudspeakers in voices chosen for their solidity. Today the voice that spoke was the commander's. It invited the pack to the track at dusk. It invited the humans to the fence line. It said, "We are going to learn something together." At dusk they gathered. The bone gate held the last of the day's color on its pale edges. The Alpha stood before the assembled packs and humans. He looked thinner because the truth had thinned him, or perhaps because the truth had shown where he had always been lean and the armor of certainty had padded him to the wrong shape. "We will keep our run," he said. "We will keep our pace. We will not keep the cold. If a cub falls and rises, he runs. If a cub falls and is carried, he runs. If a cub falls and knows he cannot be carried, he will live. He will be put to other work. He will not be buried for failing our ghosts." He looked to the bone gate. "They do not ask that of us anymore." A murmur, a low, quick current through the packs. Some bristled and their spines lifted in the old reflex. Some felt their paws become lighter. Change always takes the same path through bodies: suspicion, anger, grief, relief, love, not always in that order. A human stepped forward, tall, dust on his boots, a smile like weathered wood. He raised a hand. "May we say how we carry so your cubs know what kind hands feel like?" The Alpha nodded. "Hold beneath the ribs," the human said, demonstrating, cradling an invisible child with all the care of a man who had carried real ones through harsher places. "Don't grab an arm. Don't yank. Offer. Let them come to you with their own legs as far as they can. We don't make them weightless. We make them possible." A Rakari elder came forward then, hungry to be new in that particular way old things sometimes are. He touched the line on the ground with 2 claws and looked up. "And if you are the one being carried," he said, "do not spit on the hands that keep you. They did not come to be proud. They came to make you live." In the murmurs after, Mara felt something loosen in the collective chest. You could almost hear it. The sound of a lung that had been too tight for too long, taking the kind of breath that resets a day. Kher stood beside Mara and tilted his head, thoughtful. He was young, but youth can hold frustration elegantly. "But what of the ones who will say we are weaker now?" His voice was small and he tried to make it very large. Mara crouched and looked at him till her own eyes watered. "You cannot live a life big enough to silence people who speak from fear," she said. "You can only live a life big enough to make them wrong." Kher considered this, then nodded, not because he fully understood but because his bones did. The night after that, under a sky of careful stars, Mara could not sleep. She got up, pulled on boots, and went to the track. The lights were down to guard mode, little dots of attention along the edge. She stepped onto the line and listened. The track has a sound it makes at night when no one is looking. It hums the memory of all feet, and it forgives their cruelty for the sake of what they meant. She ran, not fast, not with the clean efficiency of a day's beginning, but with the quiet insistence of a day's end. She carried no one but the echo of a boy and an old Alpha and the bruise of a world learning softness the hard way. On the 2nd furlong she felt a presence and knew without turning that the Alpha had come. On the 3rd, Kher's small steps joined them. On the 4th, the commander took to the far side, breath steady, strides shorter. A woman who looked at sleep like a technical problem to be solved later. They ran until their bodies were warm and their minds were warmer. They ran until the track had nothing left to tell them. They finished not by plan but by consensus, the way some prayers end because the person praying knows the universe got the message. Afterwards, they stood together at the bone gate and looked at the bleached reminders. The human bone glowed a little in the light. The Rakari jaw held a shadow on one side. The Alpha reached up and touched the jaw as one touches a child's face in the dark, gently to confirm presence. "We will add no new bones unless the wind takes us without our consent," he said, not to appease a memory. Mara nodded. She looked out across the flats where the horizon had the nerve to pretend permanence. "We made our own wind today," she said. "A warmer kind." The Alpha made a small sound that was almost laughter and almost grief, which are cousins. The old pass, he said, and the words were a house and he was giving her the key, had a shrine at the last bend, a bowl. We left there a piece of what we carried so the next runners could see they were not the first to find the burden heavy. We might build such a bowl here, not for bones, for weight lifted. You should lead the building, Mara said. No, he said immediately, then rewrote himself. Yes, with you. Good, she said. They did build it. Over weeks it rose from the trackside like a low altar. The pack shaped its sides from composite and resin and the dust of their old pride. The humans set metal into it, bits from wrecked drones, old bolts from replaced engines, the small strip from a uniform that a woman had worn when she saved a child years ago and had never known what to do with. At the base they epoxied a panel with words in both tongues. Leave what you no longer need to carry, take what will help you carry another. People left stones with names written on them, wristbands from hospital wards, the small weighted beads used for prayer in 10 different traditions, a toy rocket whose nose had broken off and was now perfect. One day a ship put down, not on schedule, and a man stepped out who had Mara's jawline and a beard that had not gotten the memo to stop being young. He looked at the bowl without touching it. He touched his chest as if the journey had put a new and not altogether unpleasant pain there. I ran here, he said to no one in particular and the entire base at once. Years ago. I failed the 9th furlong. I went home and called myself a coward, and the word lived in me like an unwelcome tenant. Today, when I heard, I realized I could have asked to be carried. I did not. That was my fear. Today, if someone asks me, I will carry them. I cannot go back for me. I can go forward for them. He put down a small box, wood old from one of Earth's churches, worn smooth by 1,000 thumbs. Inside it were little folded papers. The top one read, take one prayer. The bottom one read, leave one. The Alpha watched all of this with the look of a being who has moved houses so many times he had forgotten what permanent felt like. He began to remember the taste. Kher grew. He ran with the pack and sometimes ahead of it. He learned to track not just quarry in the flats but changes in a friend's breathing, a skill which, in its own way, is a tracking of the rarest prey. When he turned his head, the cords moved like water. When he laughed, it smelled like the track in rain. One morning mid-season, a distress call came from the Red Flats. A survey team trapped in a sudden glass storm, microsilicates blasting across the surface at speeds that strip paint and hope. The Alpha took 3 strides before the sentence was finished. Mara was already moving before it started. Kher watched from the gate, the old animal in him and the new one arguing briefly. Stay, the Alpha told him, not harshly. This wind might take your skin. Kher looked at the bowl. He reached into it, grabbed a thin scarf left by a pilot who wore it into storms and somehow survived. He wrapped it around his neck and set his feet on the track. Where we carry, he said simply, I will learn to be carried. The storm was a beast. It came over the flats like a moving mirror. Sand glassed mid-flight, shards like icicle rain snapped sideways by a giant's breath. The Alpha led, fur flattened, armor clicking, teeth bared to ride the wind. Mara followed, head down, steps precise, every tendon a wire humming with the music of the rescue. They found the survey team huddled behind a broken crawler, faces bleeding from 1,000 insults. Up, the Alpha said, lifting 2 at a time in his arms as if they were cubs. Up, Mara said, and when one of them failed, she took her and the world shrank to the length between body and safety. Kher watched the Alpha steps and placed his own in the footprints, so the wind tried to strip him and only got a little. They came back across the flats in a procession of stubborn breath. The storm hit them sideways with the precise malice of natural phenomena. The base's gates opened like someone waking from a nightmare and remembering the door was not locked. The crowd pulled them in. The medics stripped glass from eyes and hair as if caring were a technical skill, which it is. Afterwards, when everyone's pulse reconsidered its options, the Alpha stepped into the center of the track and lifted his head and spoke. He did not say, "Behold." It was built into the way the air bent around him. "We have made a new pass," he said. "The bowl is the shrine. The carried are the witnesses. The carriers are the priests. There are no bones." He looked at Mara. She looked back. The world had that peculiar clarity that comes when danger has shaken all the dust from the air and left ordinary things incandescent. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." He added, quiet or careful, "You have changed the way my people count, not in numbers, in worth." She shrugged a little, the human move that is a way of handing a compliment back so it does not burn you. "You changed your own way," she said. "I only stood there long enough that you could see yourself doing it." The base's life went on. Engines spun up. Schedules turned without apology. Things broke and were repaired. People loved and died and argued about different things than before. The bowl collected what it needed and received what it didn't with grace. Once, months later, Kher fell again on the route on a day when the wind remembered it had weapons, and the heat reasserted the old logic of planets. He hit hard enough to bite his tongue. Blood filled his mouth and then left. Before Mara could reach him, one of the pack's young, a female named Tal who had run at his shoulder since their first mutual mischief, slowed and knelt and made her arms into a cradle he knew as well as his own weight. He leaned in without shame. She bore him 2 furlongs, then set him down when his breath asked to be brave again. He finished the route and they did not tell anyone, or they told everyone. The difference in cultures like this is often a matter of tone. And in time, on a far station whose name did not matter because names are just coordinates for stories, someone who had never set foot on the track told another person who never would, "Did you hear about the human who carried the exhausted cub while the Alpha followed in silence?" The way they said it, the weight in the voice, the careful respect, meant it had already become a myth. It meant it would live in mouths and muscles long after the metal of the track had been melted down to make a ship to travel to a place where a different kind of mercy was needed. The Alpha grew older the way leaders do when they stop fighting the wrong wars. He spent time in the training runs, not to win, but to set a pace that others could keep. He watched Mara from a distance that was not distance, and sometimes, when command required him to sit in meetings where words arranged themselves into elaborate, useless patterns, he would excuse himself to the fence line and listen to the wind on the bowl, and feel like he was understanding the agenda again. Mara grew older too, in the particular way humans do when they give their strength to something and the strength returns to them changed. She took on students, if that is the word for people who come to learn how to run and leave knowing how to stand beside someone while they do. She ran the track on nights when the stars were bright enough to look like cities. She carried when she needed to. She let herself be carried when she needed to, which may have been the harder wisdom. She smiled more in a way that put the weight in her mouth into the shape of gentleness rather than resistance. The day came when a delegation arrived from the Rakari homeworld's last great coastal city, representatives with elders' eyes and cubs' curiosity. They had heard the story, not as orders but as invitation. They wanted to see the bowl. They wanted to run the route. They wanted, some of them, to lay down their bones in different ways. They were met at the bone gate by the Alpha and Mara and Kher, now tall enough that his shadow no longer needed to stand on tiptoe to reach his father's. The commander stood behind them like a friend, who can be counted on to know where a wrench is when the engine stops pretending everything is fine. They walked together to the bowl. The visitors ran their fingers along its rim, feeling the roughness where the composite met the metal. They looked long at the inscriptions, touching the words as if to make sure they might be read into skin if the ink failed. One of them took a small locket from around their neck, a simple thing with nothing inside, because the body it had once carried had long since become something larger than the metal could hold. They placed it in the bowl. They said nothing aloud because the words were already in every relevant ear. The Alpha told the story the way he had learned to tell it, briefly, truthfully, with enough air left in it for the listener to breathe their own life into the spaces. When he came to the moment when he followed in silence, he said it in a way that made that silence feel like a kind of speech. And Mara stood a little to the side and watched the way their heads tilted and the way their spines, older some of them than the scar on the world where a glacier had once set down its full weight, lifted. She thought, there are days when making a small adjustment to a ritual is like moving a mountain, and there are days when it is like twisting a knob and letting in more light. The trick is to know which is which and to be brave enough to turn. The evening after they departed, Kher ran the route alone. At the 9th furlong, where the habit of falling had once made a home for him, he slowed and put his hand on the track and felt its heat. He laughed. There was a sound in the laugh that was not just relief, not just pride, but a kind of affection for the thing that had tried to kill him and had failed and had become, through a series of human and Rakari decisions, the thing that taught him how to live. Mara watched from the shade. The Alpha stood beside her, not speaking. The sun dropped. The track held the last light the way old metal does, gladly out of habit. "Do you worry," Mara asked after a time, "that someday, far away, someone will misuse this story, make it a blade instead of a bridge?" "Yes," the Alpha said. "I worry as a habit, but I hope as an act." Mara looked at him and saw that hope was not a thing he wore naturally. It fit him like new armor, awkward until you fight in it once and then impossible to take off. "Me too," she said, "so we keep living it out loud." "Yes," he said, "we keep carrying." Night folded over the base with the tenderness of an old friend who has learned where not to press. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. Time did what it does, lingered in places it liked, sprinted past places it disliked, and shook out its pockets of the small coins we call days. The track wore thin where thousands of feet had declared themselves to gravity and then changed their minds. The bowl filled and emptied, a tide that ignored the moon and obeyed only need. A ship arrived from a far cluster of trade stations with a painting. It was not good by any standard that committees agree on. It was better. It showed 3 figures in blinding white light, a human in mid-stride, a cub curled but awake, an Alpha walking, head bowed in a gesture that was not surrender and not shame but something new. The artist had painted the heat like a visible veil. They had painted the dust like a choir. The commander hung it in the mess where it could annoy people into conversation. It did. On a day of dry heat and soft wind, a batch of new recruits assembled at the line. Humans, Rakari, a scatter of other species whose vowel-rich names made sentences sing. They stood with their pride folded up and placed carefully inside their chest so it wouldn't blow away in the first gust. The Alpha paced before them like a storm testing the docks. Mara stood at the far end, arms crossed, a smile that dared them to be bigger than their fear. "The route will teach you," the Alpha said. "We are here to keep you alive long enough to listen." A young human with hair like a hayfield and eyes like a first rain raised a hand. "Sir," they said, "if we fall, will you carry us?" The Alpha's scar lifted in what passed for a smile. "If you ask for the wrong reasons, no. If you ask for the right ones, you won't need to. We will already have stepped into the place where asking lives." The young human tilted their head, almost frustrated. Mara laughed softly and added, "We'll carry you, and you'll carry us, preferably not on the same day." The recruits laughed, they ran, some fell, some were carried, some asked. Some did not need to. All of them finished in a way that changed the definition of the word. Later, sitting on the stanchion with a water bottle sweating against her palm, Mara felt the old familiar presence of the Alpha arrive and settle like an antique weapon hung above a mantle. Not there to be used, there to insist that the day should be interesting anyway. "I had a dream," the Alpha said as if reciting a report. "We were on the old pass. The wind was a blade. I ran with my father's breath in my ear. You were there, human, and you did not belong to that time, and still you were necessary. That is the dream. And then we were under our sun, and all the ice had melted, and the pass was a river with a bowl at its bend." Mara sipped. "Water is a kind of mercy too. Dreams know which bridges matter." The Alpha grunted gently. "Yes." He lifted his head toward the bowl and in the way of leaders was already thinking of the next storm. There will come a day when the carrying breaks a back, when the decision will cut the other way, when someone will say, "Enough." That day, I will try to remember your face in the bright. "Remember his," Mara said, nodding toward Kher, who at that moment sprinted across the flats with Tal at his shoulder, the two of them racing not to win but to share speed. "I will," the Alpha said. One evening, visitors arrived from a world that had known human conquest and Rakari contracts and had forgiven neither. They came in with stiff postures and baked suspicion. "Your story," their leader said at the gate, "is propaganda. You are training us to be dependent. Your softness hides a trap." Mara listened. The Alpha listened. They let the accusation rest in the dust like a heavy object that you should not lift immediately or you'll pull something. Then Mara said, "We will not convince you by arguing. Run with us. Fall if you need to. Be carried if you will allow it. Then decide." They ran. Pride drove them like a bad captain. One fell. Two more fell following. The Alpha slowed the pace without ordering it. The pack's gravity did the rest. Mara stepped into the space where refusal became harm and made an offer with her arms that included no shame and no price. The leader saw that the trap they expected, a demand, a debt, was not set. They saw that they could walk away after this and no voice would chase them calling ode. They let themselves be carried, lips tight, eyes angrier at themselves than at these strangers. Afterwards, as the medics cleaned grit from the corners of their mouths, the leader said to the Alpha, "I do not trust you." "Good," the Alpha said, "trust me slowly." They left a coin in the bowl. It was stamped with their planet's motto, "We remember." It took its place among the others. It learned to mean something broader. Weeks later, a transmission came from an academic network asking for interviews, papers, frameworks. The commander wrote back with a single page, a schedule of runs, an invitation to lace boots, and a reminder that some truths cannot be peer-reviewed because the peers haven't yet run long enough to have the right to an opinion. This caused a small storm in the journals that lasted a month and then died, as storms do when there is nothing real to blow against. On the anniversary of the day on which Kher had finished the route in Mara's arms, the base held a quiet ceremony that felt less like celebration and more like maintenance. People brought a little piece of weight and placed it in the bowl, not to give it up forever but as a promise to share it. No speeches. The Alpha said 3 sentences, the commander said 2, Mara said none. Kher said one, but he said it to Tal as they walked away hand in hand. "I will carry you." She replied, "I know." They smiled with a shared knowledge that made the air between them denser and more breathable. Time swung again and brought a big, mean season. The flats cracked in a new pattern. The wind invented another knife. A supply line failed. Then a message arrived. War had reignited somewhere far away, as wars do, because someone decided that hunger for metal and symbols could be satisfied by rearranging other people's bones. The base prepared to send bodies and engines and footnotes to places that would call them invaders or saviors, depending on what end of what barrel they were looking at. Mara stood at the hangar mouth in old armor that still fit because it had always been a little too big. The Alpha stood beside her, a new scar like a question mark near his left eye. Kher stood a pace behind, ready to follow, ready to lead, ready to do neither and be steady. This, Mara said, looking at the ships warming to fury, is not what the bowl is for. No, the Alpha said. But it is what the carriers go to when the wind lies about where the edge of the cliff is. They went to a barren world whose surface was all glass and all lies. They evacuated a town whose leader had told them to get out and then begged for water. They were carried. At the end of it, the town laid a small plate into the bowl with a picture scratched onto it of the old past their grandparents remembered in a dream they were sure they had not had. The Alpha looked at it and smiled. He did not say he knew that past now. He let the knowing be food. On the tail end of that campaign, a ship docked with theirs and someone came aboard who had been young on the base when Kher first ran. They had the look of a person who had just told the truth in a room where lies had paid the rent. They said in a voice like a new road being laid, "The story helped us pause. The pause helped us see. The seeing changed the decision. That is all." "That is everything," Mara said. They returned to the base older but with the particular youth that comes from living for a purpose bigger than grief and smaller than legend. They slept. They woke. They ran. In between, they did the laundry, which is one of the secrets of endurance no one talks about. One final day, the kind that feels like a closing bracket slid into place without malice. Mara stood alone at the track again. The light was the same as that first morning and completely new. The bones glowed. The bowl held a shadow in its hollow like a sleeping animal. She felt the weight of time in her back and greeted it like a friend who still surprises you. The Alpha came. Kher came. Tal came. The commander came. People who had moved on and somehow never left came. They did not know why they had gathered in that specific pattern except that sometimes the universe plays a chord and everyone who shares that note in their chest hears it at once. No speeches. No run. They stood. The Alpha took something from around his neck. A small plate of metal. He held it out to Mara. Engraved on it in the Rakari script that looks like claws writing their names on ice was a design, a bridge very small carrying a weight very large. "For the human who carried," he said, "for the human who let us learn what following means." Mara took it. She looked at it the way you look at a letter from a younger version of yourself that somehow arrived on time. "I was carried too," she said. "Yes," the Alpha said gently. "By us, by him." He nodded at Kher. "By the track, by the day, by the stories that came before you and made your spine into a useful corridor." She looked down the track where sunlight laid its long white road into the distance. She thought of all the feet and the breaths and the decisions cross-hatched into its surface. She thought of the cub she had lifted and the Alpha who had followed and the silence that had become language. She breathed in. She breathed out. Sometimes that is the whole ceremony and it is enough. The wind stirred and carried the smell of the bowl, old metal, sweat, the tang of resin, the bright sharp of new paper slips left by hands that shook. For a heartbeat, a high, thin sound carried over the base, a child laughing in the mess as someone told them the story again for the 100th time and made a part new that had not been new yesterday. Mara smiled. The Alpha bared his teeth, which is how his people smile. Kher and Tal looked at each other, then at the track, and took off running for no reason that needed writing down. The commander folded her arms and let her face relax into the rare expression she had practiced in mirrors and never mastered. Rest. The base hummed the low, satisfied hymn of a place that knows what it is for. If you had stood there with them and looked into the distance where the track looped out of sight, you might have thought you saw another pass entirely. Old stone ending in a bowl where river water gathered like hands. You might have thought you saw a procession of figures moving along it, some with tails and spines, some with bare scalps and hair like shadows, some tall, some small, each carrying something, each carried by something, the whole line moving forward as if pushed by nothing more complicated than breath. And if you had listened in that moment very hard, with the parts of your ears that live in your ribs, you might have heard the future loosen its shoulders just slightly and try on a kinder shape. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.